Now we're going to throw it over to Christian, who I haven't seen since Freer Fest. So it's good to see you again, Christian.
You too, man. You too. So I'm Christian Watson. I am the host of a YouTube podcast show called Pensive Politics, which lives on my YouTube channel called Christian Watson. I make political, social, and cultural commentary, which is backed up more by a philosophical viewpoint, which unfortunately is something that is sorely missing from the discourse today. Most folks take talking points and run with them. I try to dig deeper and look at underlying principles and see how things connect throughout history and the world. And so I look forward to a good conversation tonight.
Okay. He's also been featured on the BBC as well, which, good for you, Christian.
Oh, yeah. And Fox News.
Wonderful. Throwing it over to Destiny.
So for the record, I am not American either. I am Hungarian, from Eastern Europe, the hotspot of the events. So the question, should the US support Ukraine? The answer is yes. Are you fucking nuts? Like, it's a slam dunk both economically and geopolitically. Ukraine is a nation that fought essentially a civil war to align itself with the West. And so we cannot really, and they petitioned us for help. And by us, I mean NATO and NATO-aligned countries, which we commonly understand as the West. After that, for us to promise help and then break that promise and let them be overrun by Russia would be a huge geopolitical loss for the West, which would lead all kinds of other possible concessions or possible problems down the line. So I would say if we show strength now and help out, not with troops on the ground, no one is discussing troops on the ground, but equipment and generally threatening Russia with sanctions. So then that would be a good thing, essentially. The other argument is, of course, economical. Ukraine is a very rich country in natural resources. They have significant industries from aviation to rocketry. And they are going to be the next agricultural superpower because 25% of all the world's black soil is located within Ukraine, which is like the best type of soil on the planet. Having them inside eventually in the European trade bloc will lead to essentially lower food prices and all sorts of other benefits. And I oppose what Russia is doing, and I think you should too, because, well, I oppose it because I don't like imperialism. And I support Ukraine, and I think we should support Ukraine, just like how we should support Taiwan against China, i.e. a larger neighbor threatening to invade the smaller neighbor, or, that funny German gentleman who thought that, who essentially invaded German-majority areas of Czech Republic back then. I supported the smaller country in both cases and opposed the larger one for imperialistic reasons, and that's my standard.
I had no clue you were so old that you supported Czechoslovakia during that conflict. You're truly a man of experience.
You might be surprised.
Throwing it over to Christian.
Yeah, so a lot of folks might look at this matter through a geopolitical lens. I like to see it as the sort of philosopher in me likes to see it through a sort of moral lens. Because I do think that when we ask ourselves, should someone do something or support something, we're ultimately asking a moral question. If we're not asking a moral question, then we're not asking a question that necessarily compels us to do anything. But since moral questions oftentimes include rules and principles that are binding on people, or at least if they are good moral questions, they will, then that ought to be the dimension that this is approached from. Now, this is not to say the geopolitical dimension is not important. It most certainly is important. I think that it is quite important that President Biden has pulled not quote unquote non-essential diplomatic staff from Ukraine, which has made the president of Ukraine quite angry and has made him say that this is going to cause diplomatic capital to be eroded. I think that it is quite important that the American media is now buzzing over war, which has also made the president of Ukraine pretty angry and has called him, compelled him to say to ask people to moderate their tones. And really, a lot of people in Ukraine, at least according to news reports, seem to be handling this better, than a lot of us over in America or even other parts of the West, because this is quite routine for them. Russian aggression is quite routine for them. They understand how the cookie crumbles. But ultimately, the moral question is this, and I'm going to ultimately shift this question towards America, because I don't think the West as a whole has the same moral stake in Ukraine. I think different countries have different stakes in this situation. Germany, for example, has a pipeline that goes throughout there that Russia is obviously very interested in preserving, and that's a very different moral stake than what America may have in Ukraine. I don't think that the Americans have a moral obligation to help Ukraine really in any way, shape, or form. Now, does this mean that we shouldn't? Well, it depends. In which way would we? Since there's no moral obligation, this is a more open-ended question. If there was a moral obligation, then that means we would have the necessity to do so. I don't mind us using our diplomatic authority to try to challenge Putin's march westward. I don't mind us trying to do that. I do think that sanctions, obviously, in a time when inflation is at an all-time high and a time when supply chains are disrupted all around the world, sanctions would obviously not necessarily be an ideal mechanism to deal with this. And fundamentally, they're also not a really moral mechanism to deal with this as well. You cannot morally stop someone from buying or selling with another private party unless they are buying and selling goods that were stolen or something of that sort. So that's probably not a very good idea. But if we want to use diplomatic authority to challenge Putin, I have no problem with that. When it gets to sanctions, and even worse, when it gets to troops on the ground, that's when I have a problem. Because not only is the moral obligation not there, there are numerous geopolitical consequences and diplomatic consequences to such a strong show of force. So that's my opinion on the matter.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Christian. And we're going to throw it over to... Oh, 1 second. Somebody asked, can you just explain what a conservatarian is quick, like in one sentence?
Oh, yeah. So a conservatarian is someone who holds tradition to be paramount in the American sense, but also believes in the principle of individual liberty.
Okay, wonderful. Cordialities.
Thank you. So this notion about that, like Zelensky was an actor, therefore he's incompetent, and every country in Eastern Europe is run by incompetent people. I mean, this is some like boomer tier American centric shit. I believe Ronald Reagan was also an actor when he came to power. So like, I don't know if we're like, also you had Donald Trump as a president. So like, shush on that. Actually, Zelensky has been doing a pretty good job. Of course, political inexperience was a big deal. Actually, it was a big branding point also in the campaign. The rest of Eastern Europe are run by people who are either run by generally very experienced people. However, many of them are of the far right variety, including Viktor Orban, my dear prime minister. So to characterize the Ukraine situation from that perspective, I mean, I think it's pretty just misinformed. But then again, I'm very much used to people talking about the Ukraine situation from purely an American perspective. Like I've heard people saying, "Oh yeah, we shouldn't intervene at all. It's America first." And it's like, well, good, but like you're kind of forgetting about like what do we do with Europe then? Anyway, I'll let other people go. I need to hear some other points from others as well.
Well, if I might, I have no. So the question was phrased as the West, but in America, obviously, is one of the biggest contributors to NATO. In fact, Donald Trump actually did something very good by making NATO pay up a little bit, tiny bit more into contributing to the alliance, because a lot of the European countries like to spend on social safety nets as opposed to actually defending their own country. So America has tended to pick up the slack for them. But I have no problem if the European powers want to move on this issue. And really, I have no personal objection if America wants to move on this issue either. But I don't want America to move on the issue in ways that are immoral. Sanctions are immoral, whether they're sanctions against China, whether they're sanctions against Russia, they are fundamentally immoral. Because what they are doing is they are trying to disrupt an individual's ability to economically trade with someone else in a different country in the name of some broader
geopolitical. How about the annexation of Crimea, though, and the war in Donbass?
I think Putin's subterfuge in Crimea is also immoral as well. But here's the problem. I'm not arguing that Putin is some sort of hero or whatever. Obviously, he's a bad actor who wants to expand his power and who wants to, in his idea, restore the glory of the Russian Republic or whatever, Federation or whatever. My question is this: whose obligation is it to stop him? Is it America's? If so, how do you justify that obligation? Upon what grounds you justify that obligation? That's my question. What moral grounds? What moral grounds? What moral grounds?
Okay, one at a time. We're gonna have Kevin respond, and then I'll write Pixel down.
I think it's really interesting because normally when people talk about the morality of the situation, they usually concede that the West has the moral high ground here because it's a sovereign country being aggressed upon by an imperial power. But when people usually give their hesitancy to support Ukraine, it's usually justified as, well, we don't want to accidentally start a nuclear war or something. But it's interesting, you're making a moral argument that the West isn't bound to defend Ukraine. You're not even going with the potential nuclear war argument, which I find very interesting. So you're saying here, Christian, you're saying that, well, Crimea was wrong, and I'm guessing you probably think that what China's doing in Xinjiang right now to the Uyghurs is also wrong. You just think it's wrong to do anything about it. I would say that that's a gross false equivocation. No, it's a gross false equivocation. I would say this. By what means or by what right does the West have any sort of moral high ground here, or by what means does the West have an incumbency to act here? I would say very, very simple. The defense of the liberal order, a rules-based world that we want to see, and we want to prevent a slippery slope, a domino effect of Putin taking Ukraine and then coming in and taking Poland or trying to take Lithuania, etc. Because you might say it's all about America. Eventually, by your logic, Russia will literally be on America's borders, because what logic would you have to defend any other ally if you will not defend Ukraine? In other words, if Western democracy doesn't matter in Ukraine, why does it matter anywhere?
This is a ridiculous, like, slippery slope argument, right? Like, the promotion of Western democracy abroad as a foreign policy goal that we've used war to achieve has failed.
I'm talking about defending democracy. I'm not even talking about promoting democracy. I'm just saying defending an existing democracy. I want to hear Christian's response, though, first.
Yeah,
First of all, I didn't equivocate at all. To equivocate is to make two distinct things seem similar. I did not do that at all. That's number one. Number two, you're saying the West. I'm saying the United States. Now, I made a distinction earlier because the West also includes European powers. And it was clear that European powers have the ability to act on this front if they want to. My question is particularly focused on America and America's moral obligation. Now, you seem to be sourcing America's moral obligation in this sort of grand abstraction of liberal Western democracy, or whatever that means, that we have this sort of obligation to defend it. Again, where does that obligation come from? How does America have an obligation to defend abstractions, especially abstractions that are external from its own borders? That's my question. I'm not saying that I'm not saying. Well, you should take my arguments for what they are. You should take my arguments for.
So you should believe in liberty, right? Or does liberty only matter within your own border?
Okay, so no. You're kind of taking my arguments to a place where they need not be taken, because it's not logical to take them there. I'm not saying liberty is specific to certain nations, or its value is specific to certain nations. What I'm saying is that different nations interact with liberty in a very different way, and obviously there's a correct way to do that. But I think a nation has first and foremost an obligation to its own people. So the idea that America has an obligation to defend liberty everywhere is this idea which has had America spend over $2 trillion on two conflicts that were utilized by bureaucrats who used abstractions. George W. Bush used abstractions. We're going to fight terror. We're going to defeat. They used abstractions as a means to move the goalposts.
Wait. Okay. We need to let Christian finish, because Christian was finishing this point. Then we have Pixel, we have Adam as well.
The way George Bush phrased America's effort to fight terror was most certainly an abstraction, and it was built on abstract grounds, because instead of actually getting a declaration of war, what did he do? He went to Congress to give him an authorization of the use of military force. That same authorization was used to ensnare America and several other conflicts across the Middle East, and we've pulled out a lot, thanks to Trump and a lot of other, and Obama a little bit, although he decided to go ahead and go bomb more.
Can we limit answers to 20 seconds, Dylan? Because there's like 9 people here. It's going to be like, if every answer is like 2 minutes long.
Here's my point. America does not have a moral obligation to defend, quote unquote, liberty around the world. America has a moral obligation first and foremost to its own citizens. This does not mean that liberty itself is not important, but it does mean that there are different actors who have different degrees of responsibility for different people's liberties around the world.
Let the world fall and then fight the war.
Let's
keep strawmanning me.
Let's more point it. Do you think it was immoral for the U.S. to intervene during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I think we caused the Cuban Missile. We caused.
No. Wait.
We did.
Let him answer that. Okay, don't weasel out of that.
We did.
I want to know. Do you think it was immoral at the stage when missiles are being shipped to Cuba? Do you think it's immoral for the United States to intervene at that point, or should they have?
Well, not in that particular circumstance. But we actually had a very big role in causing that crisis.
Okay, I don't. Wait, hold on. I'm not trying to get into what caused it. All I'm trying to establish is that.
What? No, hold on, Destiny. It's important to know what caused it.
It's not important to know what caused it. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Wait, hold on. All I'm trying to establish is that American interest obviously can exist outside of America's borders. There are things that can happen around the world that will have an impact on our very own citizens in the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis is an obvious one. Whether you think down the road we caused it or didn't cause it, that is an obvious case of things can happen outside U.S. borders that are interested, that have like a U.S. interest attached to them. The defense of NATO, of our trade routes, of our multilateral trade agreements as the world hegemony where the United States guarantees the freedom of certain countries is ultimately important to U.S. interests in a direct way and in many indirect ways. I think that's a fair point to say. So I think if we want to attack our interest in Ukraine, we can do that. You can attack that. But I don't think you can just simply dismiss it by saying, oh, well, it's not in our borders, so it's not a U.S. interest. I think that's a very naive way of looking at how the world connects today.
And I don't think that's the case. I think that the preservation of the global economy is one of the most important things that we can do, not just for the preservation of America and NATO, but for the preservation of world peace. Because with more economic trade across the world, the more peace there has been because we're more connected. So I'm not saying that. But it's very important to know who caused the conflict, because if you cause the conflict, you therefore have an obligation to go ahead and take care of the conflict. And that's the source of my argument. America, the moral obligation to deal with the mess America called the Cuban Missile Crisis was on America. And so the moral obligation in terms of Ukraine, though, that's my question that I haven't really still gotten an answer for. So that's the difference.
Let's say that Russia rolls into Ukraine, takes it over. Then let's say Russia begins to expand into other countries and takes them over. Let's say these are countries that are effectively removed from a U.S. sphere of influence. Let's say that there are eventually more restrictive trade barriers put on them, we'll say by Russia, that inhibit them from trading from Europe or American allies. Isn't this reduction in worldwide economic freedom a negative in your view?
Sure. Well, but if we presume Russia's going to do that, I mean, I have no clue if Putin wants to take over the entirety of Europe. I don't know that. I know he certainly wants to expand his geopolitical sphere.
This is what everybody's saying, right?
Hey, can I make a point?
It's a slippery slope.
It's not a slippery slope. Hold on.
It is, because we don't have... Sorry, go on.
So Russia already has rolled tanks into Georgia. Russia already owns the Crimean Peninsula. We can't just say slippery slope every time we try to establish some chain of events. I think it's fair to say that given the opportunity to, and even with the world crying against him, it seems like Putin doesn't mind rolling Russian authority out into different places. If he was able to not even take over eastern Ukraine, but the entire rest of Ukraine, why is it a slippery slope to assume that he might try to extend that even further?
Putin has already said that, by the way. Putin has already said that with Ukraine, the ultimatum, essentially Russia gave an ultimatum to NATO and Western nations in general, saying that if you don't guarantee us that Ukraine will never be part of NATO and NATO will stop expanding, etc., if you don't guarantee that in writing, then of course we're going to invade, and we also want essentially the full restoration of the Cold War era spheres of influence. That means about 12 countries back into the neutral zone. But as the saying in Eastern Europe goes, if you choose NATO, NATO comes. If you choose Russia, Russia comes. If you choose nobody, Russia comes. So this is the situation we find ourselves in.
Well, we're in a situation where Russia has broken. Well, I guess that question in general, it wasn't so much directed towards Parker. Parker was just kind of asking some clarifying questions. My point was just more general. Why don't we, this is the question, I guess I'll direct this to Taftaj, to Conspiracy Castle, and to Christian in particular. Why would you guys prefer to forfeit Ukraine and then have to deal with Russian aggression when the battle lines are closer to us? Why not nip it in the bud, just put in some troops there and send a message to Putin to say, look, we're not going to tolerate wars against democracies in Europe, because we know if we let this go, it'll be another one and another one, because they've demonstrated this with Georgia in 2008 and Crimea and the rest of Ukraine in 2014.
I'm going to have Christian respond, because Christian raised his hand and hasn't been able to talk in a while. So I'm going to have Christian respond to that question since it was directed towards
I'll be very quick before I respond to that question. We have to deal with this argument that if you're somehow skeptical of using military force, not against Russia, but in proximity to Russia's geopolitical aggression, you are somehow on Russia's side. I can give you two reasons that are not at all pro-Russia, but are instead pro-other things, pro-common sense rather, that would lead us skeptical to such incursions. Number one, the question of moral obligation towards other countries, which I mentioned earlier, which wasn't really answered. Number two, the erosion of American diplomatic capital through continued aggression. and number 3, the continuation of American imperialism, which has caused destruction and chaos across the world. Those are 3 reasons why someone could be reasonably skeptical of going into this with a more aggressive stance that had nothing to do with being pro-Russia. And the assertion that if you are against this, or some kind of force towards Russia in this circumstance, you are pro-Russia, is absolutely an ad hominem of the lowest sort. So let's not use that argument anymore. Now, as for the battle lines and everything, look, I'm not saying let Russia seize Ukraine. I'm asking what, and I'm saying the European powers, some of whom have, again, different degrees of moral obligation and different degrees of interest in ensuring that Ukraine remains in sovereign hands, they have the ability to act. I'm particularly concerned about the United States' obligation, or lack of obligation, lack thereof of obligation, towards Ukraine. And really, I have no problem with the United States using diplomatic capital to, and even what Taft said. I mean, I've been listening very closely. I have no problem even supplying them with weapons. Now, the problem is America has supplied people with weapons in the past, and they've gotten into the wrong hands. So I typically tend to be very skeptical of that. But I have no problem even supplying them with weapons. And I do not think Biden should have pulled out our diplomatic personnel, and neither does Zelensky. And Zelensky was very mad at him for that. So there are steps we can take to ensure that Ukraine remains somewhat in America's sphere of geopolitical influence. But those steps should not at all elevate to the level of military aggression, even if it's just placing troops on Ukraine's border. The United States has no obligation to do so.
So Christian, who do you think is the imperial power in the Ukraine-Russia dynamic? Do you think it's Russia, or do you think it's America?
That's an obvious question. Obviously, Russia's the imperial power, but one's imperialism does not negate another's imperialism. America has been an imperialist nation for many decades, and that needs to be dealt with.
How does helping a sovereign country resist Russian imperialism? How is that imperialist?
Okay. That's a straw man. I just gave you a few examples of how we can actually help them without putting troops on the ground. Putting boots on the ground is another example of American imperialism. Having diplomatic personnel is not. Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Yes.
So defending a sovereign country that asks, their sovereign government asks for help. It's not like we're just invading them. Their sovereign country, their sovereign government begs for military support, and you say we can't help you. That would be imperialism. Is that
no, I didn't say you are pretending like I'm saying that you cannot help them at all. I'm saying there are more ways to help Ukraine. There are more ways to help Ukraine. There are more ways to help Ukraine.
You're characterizing sending troops there to deter an invasion. You're characterizing that as imperialism.
In the context of the American global project, absolutely, having thousands of troops situated across the world, across Europe, and countries that we are absolutely not even at war with. Yes, I absolutely think that's imperialism of a certain kind of sort.
That's
it is imperialism. No, it's not.
Really
How's it dumb? How's it dumb?
Because
dumb?
Imperialism is going in and taking over other people's shit, other people's countries without their permission.
That's one function of it. That's one function.
Imperialism.
Wait. No, it's too loud. It's too loud. Okay, I can't hear myself think. And if I can't hear myself think, then nobody can hear shit. So I'm going to have Kevin respond. Then I'm going to have Christian respond. And then we're going to move on to Pixel, Adam, then Taft. Does anybody want their name written down? But of course you can intervene at some point. But Taft, I just said your name. Yes, but he called out 4 people. I can't have every person respond.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a question
on the list. Can you add me to the list, please?
Okay, sure. But
thank you.
Last resort.
But do I get to respond now or later?
Make her respond later.
Later, but it would actually have to be later. It would have to.
Steven. He's mean.
Wait.
Yeah, he is mean, but I'm also mean. So
you're terrible.
Christian, you respond, then Kevin responded, then Christian, you can say your final word. We got to move on to Pixel, then Adam. Okay, so basically calling the American president, say America sends, say Volodymyr Zelensky asks for, say, 8,000 troops, and Biden agrees to that. And of course, Zelensky's democratically elected leader of Ukraine. You can cope about him being a reality TV guy or whatever. Trump was a reality TV guy to Alex. That I'm not saying that to Christian. But here's the thing. So you go and say you put 8,000 troops in there, and they're there, say, as a deployment of, similar to what we did in Canada with Operation Unifier there, and they're just there as basically a deterrent against the Russian invasion. My sort of point was that that's not an imperialist act. That's actually a consensual
a defense agreement between two sovereign countries. And so the only reason why you could think of that as imperialist is if you've unfortunately fallen for Russian disinformation and propaganda, and you can say you're not pro-Russia. I don't think you like Putin. I'm just saying that the consequence of your inaction is necessarily pro-Putin and how that would manifest in reality, because you would render Ukraine vulnerable to an invasion. This is why we call it peace through strength, not peace through relativism or peace through weakness. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to make a point. Was it imperialistic during the Afghan when we were leaving Afghanistan and we dropped a missile and we killed 4 innocent children? I mean, was that imperialistic?
Damage that wasn't done on purpose.
So that's not imperialistic. So those people when they died, they're just collateral damage.
It's bad to go after ISIS-K. It's bad to go after ISIS-K.
But killing 4 children are ISIS-K. I didn't know. I didn't know children can be an ISIS-K.
I want to hear from Christian because
I'm just saying.
What collateral damage is.
I understand 100% what collateral damages. I'm just saying, you're saying that America's not imperialistic. Yes, I do. You're saying that we're not imperialistic, though. Yet we're the ones that go into. In the Middle East, we're very imperialistic.
Okay. Alex, the point's been made. I want to make sure Christian can respond.
We're the ones that kill kids. You love it. There's just collateral damage when 4-year-olds get killed. Look at you're smiling. It's so cute.
Okay,
I'm smiling because you're a goober, dude.
Okay, Christian.
So when I say imperialism, so what Superpower Broadcasting is saying, yes, conquering a country and staying there, obviously, is going to be a function of imperialism. But imperialism is a multi-function, multi-purpose concept. So conquering a country through military force certainly is imperialistic. But going into a country, I don't care if it was consensual or otherwise, and projecting hegemony, projecting power through military force is an extension of the American global project, which has been imperialistic. And as laws of logic work, a premise is the basis for a conclusion. And the premise of America's intervention in Ukraine is going to be its general imperialistic project, even if that particular action is not as severe or not as, as blatant as other acts of American imperialism have been in the past. So again, it's from the same family, even if it has a different face, so to speak. And also, again, this argument that I am somehow in Putin's pocket because I may have a position that he may favor is nonsense. You should not. You should not analyze a position on the basis. You should not analyze a position's moral correctness or moral wrongness on the basis of who supports it. Rather, analyze the position on the merits itself. If a dictator were to support the proposition that 2 + 2 is 4, that does not make that proposition any more wrong than if Mother Teresa were to support it. It's about the proposition's inherent correctness. That's what we look at. And even if Putin does think that, obviously doesn't think that America should get involved because that would obviously be a wrench in his plans, that does not necessarily mean that position is tainted because he supports it. So that's all I have to say.
Okay.
So
next, Kevin. Sorry, we got to move on. There's so many people that have to talk. We got to throw it over to Pixel, then Adam.
Well, I think we've seen a lot of compelling arguments tonight. Personally, look, the American global project has to be a project of peace, not of war, not of imperialism, not of endless expansionism. It has to be one of peace. And to any extent that's possible with this situation, I support. If that means not pulling out our unessential diplomatic personnel, from the situation with Zelensky condemned as, demeaning the role of diplomatic personnel to this kind of situation. If that means keeping them there. If that means trying to, as Tav said, negotiate peace. If that means some level of humanitarian or even some level of military aid, which may mean weapons or whatever. Whatever that is short of actually having boots on the ground and projecting the aggressive show of force that the American political project internationally has projected for the past 20 plus years, anything short of that, I am okay with. But I primarily want this to be a situation where all sides come out in peace. Russia obviously will not be satisfied until it can continue its geopolitical expansion unabated. That's what they want. I mean, that's why Putin does these military exercises all around, his area and near Finland and everything, because he wants to show that he is going to be the alpha who will reclaim the glory of Russia. And so anything that America or NATO even can do to moderate that and make sure that it's peacefully resolved, I support. I still have the question though about the moral obligation. I've seen tonight moral obligation sourced in abstractions. America has no obligation to an abstraction. America has an obligation to its treaties and to its citizens. And those both are very tangible things. And so perhaps if Ukraine was in NATO, that'd be a different story. But regardless, it's been a very good conversation on this issue.
Going it now over to Alex.
Yeah, so obviously there's not much controversial about a president picking the Supreme Court. This is his constitutionally ordained duty. What is particularly egregious about what happened recently is that Biden vowed to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court on the basis of her being black and being a woman. Now, obviously, this was also a campaign promise he made as well. What I find ridiculous is that he is going to nominate someone on the basis of identity to a institution which is not concerned about identity at all. It's concerned actually with the faithful functions of preserving the Constitution and faithfully adjudicating the law. So what he really is doing is he's challenging the institution's own foundational principles by trying to incorporate his identity politics-based pick into the institution, which is dangerous. But also, again, I think that it's also bad for the woman who will be picked, because obviously that lady, no matter how qualified she might be, because Biden has vowed to pick a black woman, will be seen as a diversity hire. So now you have, not only are you violating the first principles of the institution, the Supreme Court, you're also castigating the name of the person by not explicitly picking them for their merits but for their identity. So it's an entire cluster F, you know what I'm saying? And I think that Biden should be ashamed of himself. Anyone who's pushing these ideas should be ashamed of themselves, and that the Supreme Court should have a justice, liberal or conservative, who is placed there on the basis of their merits, period.
Wonderful. Now we're going to throw it over to... You can start it, Austin.
Yeah. So, this argument that Destiny put out, and what has really been put out for a long while, recently wrote about it, that the Supreme Court should look more like America, is an argument that really confuses me for a few reasons. Number one, looking what it means to look like America is quite unquantifiable. You can look at general geographic trends and statistics and say, okay, America is going this way, therefore you would look more like America if you did this. Problem is, there are a lot of states in America. And there are a lot of states in America that may not necessarily reflect the general geographic trends, because general geographic trends are indeed general. So how do you really quantify that? You can't. And really, what epistemic value do you give an institution? Because really, the Supreme Court, Congress, businesses, any institution that people want to look like America, they're concerned with epistemic value, which basically means they're concerned with having knowledge that can allow them to function properly. The Supreme Court is concerned with having knowledgeable people on their justice board that will allow them to function according to their proper functions. There is no epistemic value to having people on the Supreme Court for the sake of diversity. Now, I will say this, but Trump and Reagan both vowed to nominate women. And guess what? As someone himself who is conservative, and someone who has decent amounts of admiration for Reagan, much less for Trump, I think that was a wrong decision. Not because they nominated a woman, but because they vowed explicitly to nominate a woman instead of nominating the best qualified candidate. So whether it comes from the left or the right, identity politics is always an epistemic pit that gives us nothing to our institutions, which does not allow us to adhere to first principles, and certainly does not add anything of merit to the functions of institutions either.
I mean, frankly, when it comes to the Supreme Court, as long as they're qualified, it's fine. It's only going to be an issue if, you're unable to find qualified Supreme Court justices who Supreme Court picks that aren't Black women. But there are great candidates who are Black women. So I don't think there's necessarily a big problem in this scenario. My only concern would be that, if you're setting a model or a precedent about what is acceptable behavior, and there are other environments, most other environments, I would say, where hiring someone purely based on the color of their skin or vowing to do that is not appropriate. And it's really it's a special environment where you're hiring only one person, and where there has been precedent previously for making sure the Supreme Court, has some diversity.
Well, look, I think that, it's totally fine. I'm not saying that it's not okay to have a Black woman on the Supreme Court. What I'm saying, it is wrong to have that as the prefix to looking at a qualified candidate. Because again, you are whittling down the pool, and you are kind of reducing, maybe not totally, but you are kind of reducing that individual to their identity features, which is what Biden precisely is doing. And here's the idea. The underlying idea is this. The underlying idea is that because Black women have supposedly not been represented in many industries in America, we have to take the equitable decision and incorporate them and their presence into more institutions to remedy that injustice. Well, the problem with that is you don't actually do that for all black women, because not all black women are impacted by one thing. There are a lot of black women who are not lawyers and who will never be on the Supreme Court. So how in the world are you helping them by putting a black lady on the Supreme Court? You're not. We should stop speaking in abstractions and look at qualifications, and stop using victimology as a criteria by which to order our institutions, because the moment we do that is the moment our first principles erupt and our institutions fall down and they die.
I think that it's important when we look at the I think that when we look at the composition of the Supreme Court, I think from a first principles point of view, I think it can be important that the members of the Supreme Court seem relatively representative in general of the United States population. I think that if we wanted to attack, sure, because the United States population in part draws its rule of law or how laws are interpreted, the Constitution, directly from the Supreme Court. And I think that if you have a country that's getting their most important legal document interpreted by a bench that doesn't look anything like them or isn't anything like them, I think that reasonably large swaths of Americans can feel like, I don't really feel like this whole body of government doesn't represent me very well, right? If you're a woman and there's a 9 men are about to make the decision on whether or not Roe v. Wade stays as law, I think that you can rightfully feel like my government doesn't represent me. And when we're living in a representative democracy, I think it's fair to point to that as an important epistemic value of the court, that where people derive their truth could come from their subjective experience, which if you read any court briefs or how people, especially Scalia, would write, that the decisions that these justices make are oftentimes very personal. They're not these arbiters of truth, these logic lords or whatever. Like, they very much draw on personal experiences to make some of these decisions.
Well, after the Warren Court has certainly done a lot of damage to the integrity of the Supreme Court, and even before the Warren Court, there are a lot of problems with the Supreme Court as well. So I'm not going to pretend that the Supreme Court justices are arbiters of truth or arbiters of moral principles, although they should be. And if you look at Marbury versus Madison, instead of citing a bunch of case law, because there really wasn't any, at least not in America, because it was the first Supreme Court case of judicial review, there was a lot of philosophy cited. So maybe the court should get back to philosophy instead of acting, as this sort of a body of subjective opinions. But another thing you mentioned something called standpoint epistemology. And standpoint epistemology is this idea that what is true to me because I experienced it or I have experiences with it. So there are certain truths that I, as a black man, can't access that a black woman or an Asian woman can access. That's standpoint epistemology. The idea with this is that knowledge is not based solely on our experiences. Knowledge is as Kant said, and he eventually went on to argue against empiricism, but he said that all knowledge arises from experience. All knowledge begins from experience, not all knowledge arises from experience. And that's the correct, and then Locke took that idea and he made sort of his empirical model of the world. There is a world that exists outside of our experience that we can observe and we can extract natural truths from. So because I am a black man does not necessarily mean I have experienced a certain amount of things that a white man hasn't. There are white people who have experienced the things that I have not have experienced. I never lived in a trailer park before. I never lived in Appalachia before. I never been dirt poor in a trailer before. But there are plenty of white folks who have experienced that. So I don't understand. What do you mean? How do you represent a black person? What does that mean, Destiny? How do you do that?
I don't think this is necessarily related to standpoint epistemology. I think that it's a more general explanation.
It is.
That we're not doing a CRT discussion, I promise, okay? I think that generally...
No, it's not about CRT. It's not about CRT at all.
I think that generally, it's fair to say that a person's subjective experience can color, if you will, how they might view the world. I think it's fair to say that women probably have unique experiences in the United States or in the world that are different from men, that black people or Asian people or Hispanic people or different types of black people, different types of people probably have experiences in the United States that might be slightly different than other groups of people. And having that sort of representation on the court, much like we like our jury to be representative of the communities we live in, probably has some value to it, at the very least, so that a democratic people feel like they're being ruled by people like them.
Well, this becomes a majoritarian problem then, because if you have like 9 Phyllis Schlafly, and for those of you who don't know, Phyllis Schlafly was a very uber-conservative activist who fought against the Equal Rights Amendment back in the, I think, 70s or 80s. You have 9 Phyllis Schlaflys on the Supreme Court. It's a woman, but a lot of women probably wouldn't like that, because Phyllis Schlafly didn't think that she thought that women should be barefoot, pregnant, and they should be in the household. But she's a woman, so this is the point. Your identity does not necessarily give you a particular set point of view, and this is the idea of identity politics.
Okay, hold on, wait. You're engaging in horrendous Phyllis argument right now. Hold on. You understand that, because I'm not saying that. Would you acknowledge, or do you live in a fantasy land, that different identities in general have different experiences in the United States?
Identities don't have experiences. People have experiences. So I reject the premise outright in the beginning.
Okay, so you don't believe that any large analysis of a people is possible. You can only look at
individuals. No, I didn't say that. No.
Okay,
I think
so then let me back up. Hold on.
I think general qualitative.
Wait.
No, Destiny, you do this a lot.
Wait, Destiny, you asked him a question. You got to let him clarify
yes,
his answer.
You do this a lot. You ask questions.
Yeah.
You ask questions, then you move away. Let me answer. So, general qualitative, analysis that a lot of sociologists do, they have a place. Although I'm very critical of qualitative analysis typically, because they don't necessarily rely too much on what is observed through quantitative analysis. I think both are obviously necessary, but I think quantitative, if we're going to be making any sort of general predictions, excuse me, I can't talk today, then we should probably look at quantitative analysis. But qualitative analysis absolutely does have a place. Sure, why not?
Do you think there are patriarchal influences that exist? Oh, sorry.
You gotta let Destiny respond.
Where?
And then
hold on.
I'm
since I see the strategy now, I'm just gonna ramble one time and then you're gonna do your thing, right? So the strategy is to constantly duck and evade the obvious point and answer the most obtuse way possible. So it seems like yes. So it seems like you have a reasonable point.
The strategy is to rebuke the premises because they're false.
I'm being interrupted.
You're interrupting his answer. I helped him.
Okay, so the obvious answer to anybody with two eyes that looks around them in the world is that different groups of people tend to have different types of experiences. That's why that if you as a black man are charged with murder or charged with raping a white woman, and then you go to jail and your juror are 9 white women and you're from Alabama, you might think, hey, this feels a little bit fucked up. 99% of people in that situation wouldn't go, these 9 women, it is possible that all of them are marching with BLM and now they've come to sit on my court. Obviously, we can speak in broad generalities about how different groups of people have different experiences in the United States. This is why, broadly speaking, people around the world like to be represented by people like them. Whether we're talking about football and we like to see different countries represented in the World Cup, whether we're talking about a jury of our peers that we want to look like us, whether we're talking about the makeup of Congress, whether we're talking about the community police that police us. In general, people like to feel like they're being represented in a representative democracy. So I think it's fair to say that the composition of a court probably should be roughly similar or attempt at least to match the composition of the people, holding all things equal. We still want them to be qualified candidates and everything, of course. I think that if there was one attack you wanted to make on the Supreme Court, one horrible thing that we've done to the Supreme Court that I think is by far the most damaging thing we've done to the Supreme Court is when we start to pick Supreme Court justices that lean left or lean right. I think that is the most damaging thing we've ever done. Way before we get into identity politics or anything else, I think that is the most damaging thing we've done to the court when we've tried to balance it with liberals and conservatives. That is ridiculous to me.
Okay, I gotta there's like 6 people on the list to talk, and don't worry, you're about to talk again because Pixel was going to ask you a question.
Yeah, I was just curious if you think that there are patriarchal influences that filter down through the American democratic system right now, and if any sort of like pushback towards that for representation for women was a particularly important thing to you.
Well, define patriarchal. What do you mean? Like in what?
As in, like, okay, basically that your entire country has been run by men for.
Why? Okay, look. Here's my deal. Yes, obviously there have been instances throughout American history where women have not been given a fair shake. I'm not going to deny that. That's very obvious. That's why we had people like Susan B. Anthony fought for women's suffrage. Although I think that any kind of suffrage, this is where my sort of libertarian leanings come in. Any kind of quote unquote suffrage is nonsensical and immoral because you cannot create virtuous outcomes by force, and what the government really is force. But that's a different situation. But no, they're absolutely, well, you can think it's cringe all you want, but that's not an argument. So there are actually instances throughout American history where absolutely women have been given a fair shake. But I think the fair shake has more so happened socially. Yes, you're correct. There was a sort of dominance of men, especially back in the 50s and 60s, even really before the sexual revolution, over the household. And we can absolutely analyze that from a social viewpoint and see if that was bad or not. I think any ideology that tries to restrict the agency of someone because of what they look like is bad. And yes, there have been patriarchy in America that has done that. But do I think the fact that the institutions throughout America have been historically run by men is inherently patriarchal? No. Because men are the subjects of patriarchy, but patriarchy is more than simply a man being in control. So that's the problem with these sort of third-wave feminist ideas, because they're not really feminists, they're misandrists. They actually hate men, and they want to do everything they can to bring the idea of men down, including castigating them by association.
That is not my idea of feminism. So
I'm not saying yours. I'm saying third wave.
You're putting words in my mouth like that. No, I think
yours.
That people are just looking for a far more intersectional representation of like ideas and beliefs that exist in America. And if you are like patriotic and believe in the democracy that has been created by America, we should be pushing for more equal representation because
I don't believe in democracy.
Oh.
Okay.
No, I think America is not a democracy.
Okay.
I don't believe in democracy.
Okay.
I don't believe in democracy.
Yeah, libertarian doesn't believe in democracy. Who would
I believe in? No, I don't.
Wait, are you a libertarian?
Yes.
With the
Yeah.
bears?
What do you believe
like
in,
the
then?
libertarian with the bears? Was it New Hampshire? Was it the bear, Colin? Or was it the bears?
What?
Wasn't there a
Bears.
libertarian colony in America somewhere? But it didn't last very long because the
Oh.
bears came in and
Well,
ate
I
all
mean, okay. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of
libertarianism is not.
There's a lot of libertarian
ideology,
pop-ups.
so.
Of course it is. Of course, there's libertarianism.
So why are you so
Libertarian-
passionate
okay,
about
idiot.
the idea of the Supreme Court if you're a libertarian? Like,
Well,
why is your opinion so strong on
because
this?
I have to deal with practical circumstances, and a lot of folks think that libertarians are not to deal with practical stuff. We do. I have to deal with practical circumstances. At least I do, as someone who is interested in philosophy and who actually wants to help the American experiment get better and better and better. I have to deal with practical circumstances, and in my opinion, trying to distort the image of the Supreme Court by injecting equity and diversity and inclusion into the Supreme Court is going to hurt the American experiment. So I have a moral obligation to stand up for not for the Supreme Court, for the American experiment in the form of that kind of resistance. Righteous truth-telling.
Your version of America is rooted in not the 1950s, but probably at the 1850s at this level.
Oh, Jesus.
What
All these ad hominems.
opposition, what moral opposition would you have had? Like, again, we saw this in the previous segment where you couldn't tell that that moral action was needed to be taken against Russia. What moral argument would you have against the abolition of slavery then? Because the logical conclusion of what you're arguing, and I've got a question for you as well.
Dude, you're comparing the Supreme Court justice to the abolition
You're
of slavery. That shows you how dumb that is the dumbest analogy I've ever heard in my life.
Wait, Alex.
Cringe.
Wait,
Talk about cringe.
Alex.
You like to go cringe.
Alex. Okay,
That's
wait.
cringe.
No. Please, wait, everybody, please let Kevin finish asking the black person why he'd be against slavery. Continue.
Yeah, no, I'm just, it's a simple question. It's a simple a question that I have basically, which is that you've said that you're against democracy. You've said that suffrage would be forcing people to have rights. And you've also said that you're opposed to injecting equity and whatnot into the Supreme Court. The world that you're laying out is a very reactionary vision of America that's not shared by most Americans and not in the direction that America is moving. And I think that the founding fathers of America ultimately envisioned a self-perfecting system that they knew that they were flawed from the outset. And it seems like you want to keep a lot of these flaws and maintain their sort of institutionalization. My question for you, Christian, is very simple, which is that you said in your intro, you said that that you felt that what does this do for everybody who's black or everybody who's a woman? Because you said that that not everybody who meets those characteristics is in the judiciary, but you acknowledged, it was almost implicit in your acknowledgement there, that this would be helpful or could be seen as helpful if you are black and a woman and you're in law. So I guess my question is, your logic seems to be, because we can only kind of solve one thing a little bit here that only affects a few people, and we can't do everything at the same time at once, therefore do nothing. My question to you is, do you actually genuinely want to help people that are historically disadvantaged, or is it almost concern trolling, I guess is what I'm asking.
Oh my Jesus. So what you're doing there is, first of all, you equivocated. So there is absolutely no similarity between the abolition of slavery, which was a righteous cause founded on the principle of natural law, and the idea of having a black woman in the Supreme Court or in the corporate boardroom. There is absolutely no relationship to me that seems to be very clear between those two. Putting people in bondage against their rights is a violation of their natural rights, and that's something that obviously every moral person should respond to. Putting a black woman in an institution to say that you are now representing people, when in all reality there is no one person of any group that represents anyone of that group, that is not the same thing, and that is an absurdity. And that is my point. I want to help people who have been quote unquote historically disadvantaged by allowing us to have a meritocratic, a colorblind system that does not take into account their identity or their race, but takes into account what they can do. The problem is, and this is what W.E.B. Du Bois said in The Soul of Black Folk, the problem has never been that black folks have been unqualified. W.E.B. Du Bois said that the black race will be saved by its best, he said the Negro race will be saved by its best men. The problem is their merits have not been historically, in a lot of places historically, not been acknowledged by the broader system, or they have been forcibly suppressed by the broader system. So what do? You change that, not by trying to do a sort of reverse type of thing where you look at their skin color and above their merits and then put them in positions, but you change that by looking blindly at their merits. And you do that by embracing a colorblind system that does not embrace diversity, equity, or inclusion. You are presuming that DEI, or having this sort of equitable mindset, is the only way to correct historical injustice, and that is absolutely not correct. So I think that your argument is just absolutely. Well, then your argument acts. Your argument. One second. No. Your argument acts that this is the only way, because you have been saying, well, you don't want to do this or that, so you must not want to help people. No, I don't want to buy into the system. I don't want to buy into the false paradigm that says these are the ways we have to address these issues. There are ways that are not particularly orthodox that we can use to address these issues that embrace a spirit of radical individualism that are founded upon the American system.
So you'd have to actually lay out an alternative way then, as opposed to just going into abstract.
I just did.
Because you said earlier. Well, no, you haven't. You said earlier that you opposed suffrage and that you thought that suffrage was wrong. But
yes.
you're trying to claim now that the abolition of slavery was justified. But in both of those cases, you're using force to emancipate people, though. So on what grounds? Because it kind of sounds like you're an advocate of the literal patriarchy at this point, is what it sounds like.
No. So again, you're drawing together.
One second though, Christian. After Christian's response, we got to go to other people on the list. Christian's talking for like 40% of this topic, so just other people.
Sure, understood. And my apologies. So again, you're drawing together a bunch of things that are not necessarily related. Me being opposed to equity does not mean I'm in favor of the patriarchy. There's no relation between the two. And me being opposed to the idea, me being opposed to suffrage does also not mean I'm in favor of the patriarchy either. By the way, because the suffrage has been used, quote unquote, by the patriarchy to advance their causes too. So it's a sort of all-purpose tool, isn't it? So the idea of suffrage, I'm against it. And one of my favorite philosophers, Lysander Spooner, wrote an essay about this. And what she basically says, there's nothing wrong with women and they have natural rights, but there's something wrong with thinking you can affect moral change through an inherently immoral system, and that immoral system is voting. And voting is immoral because it utilizes force, many times illegitimately. Now, this is where I don't agree with Spooner's argument. He would have the entire government. No. I'm trying to qualify. He'd have the entire government abolished. I wouldn't. But a lot of times, in the current era, even back then, government is involved in areas where it has no moral right to be. And when voting is a thing, it can allow people to affect those areas and further entrench government involvement. So that's why I'm against this idea of suffrage and as a right per se. Now, I'm not against the idea of voting in principle. I think that it's a privilege. I think that it's important to a republic to be able to vote, but it's not necessarily a sacred right that allows us to be virtuous, to make good moral decisions, or be good citizens. Not necessarily. So that's my opinion. I don't want to talk for too long, but it's a very nuanced idea I have. And no, I'm not in support of the patriarchy because I don't think that voting's a right.
They're not the most marginalized people, though. I'm just saying there's other people. So what? But why not a Hispanic? Why not a Filipino? There's America's a melting pot. I'm saying why does it have to be a black woman? Do you see what I'm saying? That's the problem.
I think for the first time in this debate, Conspiracy Castle's making some sense. He's correct. From the left, there is this sort of.
You guys just don't want to believe it. That's fine.
From the left, there is this sort of intersectional hierarchy that says that the more your identity is intersects with oppression, the more oppressed you are, and therefore the more equity you need. Okay, if that's the case, then being black and a woman, those are two categories according to a lot of left-wing ideology that do intersect with certain kinds of oppression. But if you're black, if you're a woman, if you're obese, and if you're trans. You're trans woman rather, you have more identities. If you're disabled, more. So again, there could be a critique from the left saying, why isn't Biden including more identities in that? And I'm certain there are critiques from the left about that too. But the general point,
no one is seriously making that criticism though. Maybe
perhaps not, but it's one that can be. It's one, if you believe in intersectionality, absolutely can be made.
It definitely can be made.
Wait. Too many people speaking at once. Christian, you can finish your point, and then we got to wrap up, okay?
Okay. Here's my general point about this, okay? So I have no problem with a black woman being on the Supreme Court. There are plenty of black women who are conservative jurists, or who have not even always even voted with the conservative side. Barack Obama, I forgot, she's a woman in Arizona, I forgot what her name was, but Barack Obama, when he was a senator, accused her of being a judicial activist. Barack Obama accusing someone of being a judicial activist, and he goes on and appoints some of the biggest activists in the court's history, which is interesting. So, but there are plenty of qualified women, black women that Biden could absolutely pick who are conservative. But the problem is, it's not just about them being a black woman; it's about them being a black woman who's also progressive. And in my opinion, you should not have the identity qualifier at the forefront of a consideration that is going to impact an institution which is crucial to preserving and adjudicating the Constitution, which is the document upon which the American political project rests. That's what I'm saying. Identity has no relation to that whatsoever. And I don't care if people think that if someone is black and they're black, they have a relationship with them, this sort of metaphysical relationship. It's nonsense. I don't have a metaphysical relationship with someone just because they're black. If I don't know them, if I have nothing in common with them, regardless of our skin color, I have nothing in common with them. I consort with people. But no, the argument is that people want to feel represented, and having someone who's black might make black folks feel more represented. That's nonsense, though, because I'm not necessarily represented just because someone is black. If I have nothing in common with them, I don't share values with them, that does not mean I'll be represented. I mean, if Louis Farrakhan became a big political figure, he's black, but I don't agree with anything the man says. So skin color
literally
should
no one is
be
arguing that. Nobody's arguing
no,
that.
But nobody's
people are arguing that. People are arguing that people want to be more represented, and they
be more represented doesn't necessarily 100% mean that. It's not a 100% like, oh, that guy's black, I'm black, we have all the same interests. It's
so
we
why
start
isn't
speaking probabilities.
Okay, so
you're
can't
still one person, Christian.
you guys are like that America should have people of different experiences and different beliefs. I agree, but you seem to be aligning that with skin color or some kind of other identity, gender or whatever.
Because skin color is one identity that you can live a life through.
But you're also not acknowledging that there has been an
Okay, there's a bunch of people piling on at the same time. Pixel, finish.
Why can't you have...
Okay, one second. Pixel, could you finish your question? Then Watson will have like 20 seconds to respond. We got to wrap up.
It seems like you're ignoring the fact that there has always been an underlying identity qualifier for the Supreme Court in the first place, which was that you were a white man at the start, right? Like, and that kind of idea has filtered down through the system. So, like, the idea of identity qualifiers has always been there, except now it's a little bit different, and it's trying to be more representative of a population in general.
And as I mentioned, instead of embracing the reverse of the original wretched idea of using identity as a qualifier for someone, you ought to reject it outright and embrace colorblindness full stop. That's all I'll say about this.
You ever think there's a scenario where someone's...
Taft.
Okay. We'll move on.
It's kind of funny that 9 white people are telling a black guy about cultural representation.
Okay. We're going to know.
It's ironic.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay.
Somewhere below the white person. And so at that point, the person who worked the hardest should get the position. So there's that. But I'm not looking to open an argument on that. I just wanted to put it out there. As for the meritocratic argument, of course, as people said, meritocracy at this point cannot work yet. It's a nice future prospect, but it's the same way as like it's as if you instituted like limitless free market in the U.S. tomorrow by just like removing the government. That's cool, but then 2 days later you're going to be living in the Bezos empire because because of all his leverage and because of all the advantage he built up, which he will leverage, of course, in pursuit of power. So, yeah, that's my take.
He wouldn't have subsidies anymore.
Christian, you're next.
Well, I guess.
Anyway. Yeah, so look, I think that it's quite obvious what the answer is here. If you're looking at this from a first principles foundational perspective on the American experiment, and you guys can laugh all you want, but the answer here is very simple. We pick someone who is concerned with executing the functions faithfully of the Supreme Court, and you pick someone who is concerned with doing that, and not someone on the basis of what they look like or what you presume their experience to be, because they're a black woman or whatever consortment of identities you've managed to concoct in your paradigm. The Supreme Court has a very particular duty, and the United States has a very particular duty to its institutions, and we should have an eye on preserving those and not preserving our ideas of what they should look like when those ideas may not add anything that is epistemically beneficial to the institutions themselves.
What a Christian.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people have hit on a good point here by saying conversation is important. But more than conversation, the foundational basis upon which we pursue conversation for is even more important. The philosopher Hugo Grotius, who many folks haven't heard of, but the American founders certainly knew who he was. And John Locke certainly knew who he was because John Locke actually took a lot of influence from him. He said that man, along with being a social creature, which wasn't really unique or new to him, he said that along with being a social creature, man's existence also is interested in a peaceable relation with other people. So while we are a social creature, that doesn't just mean we can talk or anything. It means we also want to build civilization, community, society. There is a natural interest for us to want to do this. But in order for us to do this kind of thing, we have to recognize, this is a point that he makes, others make as well, that there has to be a self-love that we have for ourselves. Because in order to build something with other people, we have to love and respect ourselves. The problem is a problem of resentment. And in politics these days, politics is oftentimes a game of resentment. A lot of people hate. They hate. And they hate so much they forget how to love. So I do think, in a sense, that love of self, at least, is the basis for how we can continue, even having a common basis. Because we can disagree on every single other thing. But if we can agree on, we love ourselves enough to work together in concert to achieve some common name, even if we don't know what it is, then that'll be enough, to save civilization. So conversation is important, but self-love is also important. And increasing that amount of self-love in the conversation is also equally important.
Wow. Destiny, do you love everyone on this panel?
Yeah.
I have no reason not to.
Love me the most, though, right, Destiny? Right? You
I do like Conspiracy Council the most.
And that's the thing. We can
Thank you. I appreciate you being honest.
We can viciously and angrily disagree with each other, but at the end of the day, walk away hopefully saying, this is a good faith conversation. I hope to have more. That's self-love transposed into universal love of community.
Amazing. We're going to throw it now over to Adam to wrap up the intros for the final topic.
Sure. So unity in America. Well, right. As others have said, the problem is that these two sides have diverged too far from each other. However, I don't think this can be solved with self-love. Yeah, we can all, like in this panel, we're all cordial, we're all intellectual, we're all polite to each other. But what if I was some kind of groiper, and I said to Christian, "Hey, Christian, as soon as we get into power, we're going to deport you back to Africa, and we don't give a shit. So, goodbye." So at that point, there can be, as you can see, there are certain limits beyond which there's just no cooperation, and just there's no real way of coming together as a nation, right? I think America is pretty close to that point, actually. But this is due to so many reasons. One of which is American media. America doesn't have a state media, mostly impartial state media, like the BBC, Czech television, established European broadcasters, which are, for the most part, try to be impartial. Instead, there is for-profit news organizations, and of course, CNN, MSNBC, etc. Those are some NPC, whatever, Virtue Signal, etc. for-profit kind of news organizations. But then there is Fox News, which is that plus with a cause, Rupert Murdoch is the owner, or is I believe the chairman currently. There's, in America, I see mostly on the right wing, this very sometimes well organized essentially disinfo networks on par with RT. So we have the fucking breakdown over Minnie, I think, the Disney's Minnie Mouse having the suit thingy instead of the skirt. Now we have in America there's all these it's sort of manufactured outrages, and sometimes these manufactured outrages actually go a bit beyond, Minnie Mouse and stuff. Sometimes it's Tucker Carlson making thinly veiled white supremacist statements on air. So, and I don't see this slowing down. We've even gone so far in America as January 6th, for example. So I have no idea at this point how America could be united. Maybe with time, some people will grow out of it, and or one solution I can see is that conservatives and right-wing people in general who vote Republican, etc., they will slowly fade into irrelevance, and then the Democratic Party will keep winning the elections, and then the real presidential election becomes the Democratic primary, and with that at least you have the sort of right-wing part of the country contained, and so the differences will become somewhat irrelevant.
Okay, now who wants to start off the open panel? Okay, Christian once again.
Adam, something. I think that
yeah, let Taft.
We're gonna throw it to Walker is next.
Walker.
Oh, sorry, Watson.
Oh, that's funny. No, I want to echo what Taft and Destiny said. Conversation is important, Aristotle really has a very cynical and dismal view of civilization. John Stuart Mill had the radical idea that that discourse was the bridge between error and truth. And really, the reason, again, why a lot of people embrace falsehood is because human beings are creatures of desire. We desire something a little bit bigger than ourselves. We desire community, and a lot of folks happen to just fall into the wrong kind of people who say the right kind of things, or what sound like the right kind of things to them, and soothe their ears, and that brings them down this long tailspin. This is how cults happen. This is how the Ku Klux Klan has got a lot of its members even in. And Daryl Davis has used the principle of discourse to go ahead and convince many Klansmen to shed the robe and embrace a colorblind idea and forego their racism. So discussion is absolutely imperative to beating bad ideas. I mean, sectioning off an entire part of the country, like Hillary Clinton did, calling them deplorables or undesirables, doesn't do anything but cause more resentment and cause bad ideas to flourish even more. So we have to confront this with discourse, not with derision. Why not ask people why they believe the things they believe and then use scrutiny to analyze those beliefs? Yes, there are some people who are indeed way far gone. I agree. And how society, or how rather us as individuals, not society, us as individuals handle those kind of folks is going to be a very different conversation. But a lot of folks are quite agreeable, at least on some basic things. And so you shouldn't just count off a bunch of people, write off a bunch of people rather, from being reasoned with because they held some beliefs that you personally find to be heinous or incorrect. Again, this is the Daryl Davis principle. Go in to the dens of the Klansmen, show them kindness, talk to them, explain to them nicely why they're wrong, and if some of them will not shed their beliefs, but many of them did and are continuing to do so, and they're leaving that ideology, and colorblindness and racial equality are getting more advocates, which makes the ideas that you want to see succeed even more popular. That's the principle we should be embracing. And so this idea that people who are, again, deplorables, they're far gone, that's just not an idea that's going to be contributive to a free and prospering civilization. It's contributive to an insular civilization that is going to eventually evolve into some kind of internal conflict and perhaps collapse from it or whatever.
Well, Christian, the problem with that, though, is that when Hillary Clinton said that there was 50%, she said about half of Trump supporters were deplorables. She was correct about that, and that those people in recent years have gotten far more radicalized to the point where One America News Network is the liberal wing of their movement. That's how it's a problem. Okay. And I think, any sort of serious discussion about this can't just be, okay, well, let's just sit down and talk to people on the other side. We actually have to look at what's the source of the problem, because there was always division in America, but social media and the internet allowed foreign countries, foreign enemies to take advantage of that. And we can't do that to Russia because Russia censors their own media. Russia meddles in their own media. They have their own state media. So they can do it to us, but we can't do it to them. Now, I'm not arguing we should be like them, but it is a vulnerability of an open society and a democracy. And I think that we need to be aware of it. And we should have legislation to keep out media propaganda from hostile countries. Would you be opposed to that?
Yeah. Because, again, the internet has sort of democratized and connected the entire world together. And so, even if you explicitly ban foreign regimes from advertising in America, there are other ways that foreign regimes can get their stuff into America. So instead of trying to ban and censor things, why not? I wouldn't even be opposed to, and this is a little bit even too much for me, so the government releasing some sort of national security notice that's like a handbook. Here's how you can recognize the signs of foreign influence in certain kinds of ads. I wouldn't be opposed to that, because yes, it can be a national security problem in some cases. But banning and censoring things will not stop a regime that is aggressively determined on influencing American minds from doing so.
It'll make it slow them down considerably. So the government, you're fine with the government. You're fine. Wait. You're fine with the government acknowledging that it's a security threat, but you're not okay with the government addressing that threat. You just say leave people to their own devices, because that's not working. Putin's winning the information war right now, and it's unfortunate.
The founders understood that you need a virtuous people for a free society, and you cannot legislate virtue into the internet.
It's not a virtuous people, it's an educated people.
Well, education is a virtue. Education is a virtue.
Okay, but they never could have predicted that Putin would use propaganda and information warfare the way that he's doing, right?
The point is much less about the founders and more so about the principle of people being self-educated and having the knowledge to combat these things themselves, because that's going to be much more powerful, in my opinion.
Self-education is the problem, though, right? Because the American education system is so flawed in so many ways.
Yes,
the self-education system is not working because you literally have QAnon, which got exported to like my country as well and everywhere else.
Hey, I gotta say
And
this.
the
You guys keep on
anti-vax,
talking,
which
but I
was
want to say this. Why is everybody saying the right? Joe Biden just got 81 million votes and is our president. Why are you guys keep on talking that everybody's so right in America? I would say that America's more progressive than right. I mean, you guys aren't living in America, obviously.
80 million people still voted for Trump, though, right?
Yeah, but I'm saying so more. If you know 81 million, there's so more people are progressive. So Trump lost. Do you know that?
Yes, but that's
the Vax Song Man and the Canadian. So we're probably going to wrap it up since we're at 11:12. So I'm going to start with Christian because Christian wants to say something.
Yeah, I think that, and this is a problem across political spectrum too. I think that a lot of progressives tend to overstate the influence of QAnon, a lot of the fringer groups in the Trump camp. Lo and behold, the Trump camp most certainly has brought out some elements of the country that are horrid and that should not at all be embraced at all. Not means we shouldn't talk to them, but they're just some elements that are just have bad beliefs. But most people, I think, who voted for Trump voted as a protest statement against the establishment, the typical everyday establishment, doings of Washington. Mitch McConnell saying we're going to balance the budget and going ahead and passing a $1 trillion omnibus bill. John Boehner saying we're going to cut cap and balance and going ahead and funding and funding some of Barack Obama's one of the biggest spending expenses. I mean, there are all kind of reasons why Trump was voted in, and to say that racism was one of them is really to overstate the importance of that. And really, I think conservatives overstate the amount of socialists on the left. A lot of folks on the left really aren't socialist. A lot of folks on the left are basically progressive. Some are neoliberals or whatever. Some don't think liberals on the left. I think they are. But a lot of them are not, strict socialists. So I think that the fundamental attribution error is a psychological phenomenon, has an impact on all of us. But ultimately, to wrap this all up, I think that, again, that we have a basis within our humanity for civilizational unity. And I think that if we channel that basis, if we use self-love as a general rule, because obviously not everyone is going to adhere to that principle, but if we use self-love as a way to interact with the community and as a way to respect others, we can get past our political differences insofar as we can sustain a civilization and still argue honestly and earnestly like we've done tonight. So I appreciate it, guys, and this has been a wonderful conversation.
Wonderful. And where can people find you?
Oh, yeah, so you can find me on, I'm scared for this one because I've been saying some crazy stuff tonight, I guess. You can find me on Twitter or at @OfficialCWatson, or you can find me on YouTube. My YouTube channel is Christian Watson. You just type it in on YouTube. It's Christian Watson, W-A-T-S-O-N. And you can go to christianjwatson.com and email me if you want to. And I look forward to interacting with the folks who I've been speaking to tonight.
Wonderful. Happy to have you on.